We're going to be going over the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. Now, the categorical imperative has three different formulations. The first one is the principle of the law of nature. The second one is the principle of ends, and the third one is the principle of autonomy. The one that we're going to be going over in this lecture is the principle of the law of nature. Now, the principle of the law of nature states this: act as though the maxim of your action were by your will to become a universal law of nature. So what Kant is trying to do is he is presenting a method of doing ethics so that he can formulate a rule, a moral rule that is binding. In other words, a good moral rule that people have to follow because it's true. And so the principle of the law of nature, again, says act as though the maxim of your action, and we're going to go over these parts in a second, were by your will to become a universal law of nature. Now, the first thing that we have to understand is what a maxim is. A maxim, especially for our purposes right now, is a general rule concerning how to act. It's just a general rule concerning how to act. And so the first thing that you would do in order to determine if an act that you were thinking about doing or that you're looking at somebody else do or something, to see if it is morally correct, the first thing that you would do is formulate a maxim of action. Remember, we're trying to see if some action is morally correct or morally right. And so the first thing we're going to do is formulate a maxim of action. In other words, a rule for acting. So for example, maybe if I was thinking about, maybe I was a little hungry and I'm in a store and I'm thinking about, I don't have any money, so I'm thinking about stealing a candy bar. And so I'm trying to figure out, whoa, is this a good act that I'm going to be doing? Because I'm hungry and I don't have any money, so maybe I could just take this. Maybe that's morally correct. And so the first thing I'm going to try to figure out if this is a morally good act is I'm going to formulate a maxim of action. And so I might say something like this: whenever I am a little hungry and I don't have any money, I should steal a candy bar, or it's all right for me to steal a candy bar. So that is my maxim of action. In other words, it's very particular. It's about me. Okay, but we're not done yet. We have to test this thing to see if it can become a good moral rule that applies to everybody. And so I'm going to do the second step here. I'm going to universalize the maxim. And so I would say something like this about the rule I just stated, if I could remember it properly. Whenever anyone is a little hungry, they should steal a candy bar from a store, or it's all right for them to steal a candy bar from a store. Okay, so when we universalized the maxim, and if we think about it a little bit, would that be a good functioning society if everybody, when they get a little bit hungry, they're stealing candy bars or whatever, or food from a store? Obviously, this would be an absurd moral statement, because it would lead to a very dysfunctional society. Okay, you wouldn't even be able to have functioning stores anymore if everybody just thought this was morally acceptable to do. You wouldn't have candy bars to steal. Right? It's absurd on a numerous amount of levels. Okay, so that maxim of action did not pass. Okay, this rule that I formulated for myself, and then I tried to universalize it to see if it could be a general moral rule accepted by everybody, it didn't pass. Okay, it was obviously absurd. And so it did not lead to a morally good rule that would lead to morally good actions. Okay, so Kant gives an example a little bit more serious than the one I just gave. And he talks about, he gives many examples, but the one we're going to talk about is the one about suicide. So he's against suicide because Kant is a faithful Christian, and most Christians are against suicide, and especially back in his days. And so he has this moral rule, but he's not going to be relying just on the Christian faith, okay, apart from reason. Not to say that Christian faith is totally separate from reason, but in other words, he's not just going to try to show that suicide is wrong by opening up the Bible and showing you a scripture passage or something like that. He is going to try to show that suicide is wrong by using reason. Okay. Now, one thing I should have said earlier is that all of this is dependent on the goodwill. Okay, remember when we stated the principle of the law of nature is that you will it. What Kant means by willing something to be a universal law of nature is that you are willing it with your goodwill. In other words, with good intentions. All right. And so here's his maxim of action concerning suicide. Whenever it seems like my present and future life will be more painful than pleasurable, then I ought to kill myself. Okay, so this is his maxim of action for somebody who is thinking about committing suicide, but they want to check it to see if it's morally all right for them to do this, all right, to commit suicide. And so that person is saying, they're saying to themselves, whenever it seems like my present and future life will be more painful than pleasurable, then I ought to kill myself, or I ought to be able to kill myself. All right. So he uses painful and pleasurable because pain and pleasure, the idea of pain is one of the main concepts and part of the main reasons that those who think that suicide is morally permissible, this is one of the main concepts, the main ideas that they use to justify suicide. I mean, if you just think about it, if you've heard arguments in favor of suicide, it usually involves situations where people are in a tremendous amount of pain. And it may be pain that eventually is going to lead to their death. And so that's our maxim of action. And so we have to universalize it to see if it's all right, to see if it makes sense, to see if it's not absurd. Because when things are absurd, chances are you got a contradiction going on. And we don't really like contradictions because it shows that we're not being logical or we're not being reasonable. And so when we universalize this maxim of action, we can say something like this. Whenever it seems like anyone's present and future life will be more painful than pleasurable, then that person ought to kill him or herself. So whenever anyone's present and future life will be more painful than pleasurable, then they ought to be able to kill themselves. And so what Kant is going to say about this is we have a contradiction here. The contradiction involves the use of the term pain. Now, when we think about pain a little bit, pain is meant for our survival. Pain helps us survive. If you look at that burner right there. If you put your finger right there next to that burner, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to get burned. But before you start getting really burned, what are you going to do? You're going to pull your finger away because it's going to hurt. In other words, the pain that you're experiencing is going to help you avoid more pain. In other words, eventually, if the fire's big enough, feeling pain next to something hot can save your life. It can help you survive. If there's a raging inferno somewhere, or let's say you wake up in the morning, you go down the hallway and there's fire, there's heat coming out of the room and it's starting to burn you a little bit, you're going to move away. because pain helps you survive. It seems that is the primary function of pain. Look at this guy right here on the right. He's got a stomach ache. Maybe he's hungry. Looks like he's hungry. Maybe he's not hungry. Maybe it's something else. Maybe he has it doesn't really matter what it is. If he's got a stomach ache from being hungry, then what is it telling him? This guy needs to eat, or else he's going to die. That's what the stomach pains are for. That's what the pain is. The stomach is aching because you haven't eaten anything. Your body's trying to tell you, you need to eat something. You need to replenish yourself. But what if it's not even from being hungry? What if you have a stomach ache from something else? Well, your body's trying to tell you something still. Something's wrong. You got to, if it's serious pain, you should probably check that out. If you got serious pain anywhere, the doctors are always saying this, you got some pain going on, don't just sit with it. Don't just go take a bunch of aspirin to hide it. You got to check it out to see if the pain is telling you something more serious about your health where you may die. And so pain is helping us, and it is keeping us from dying, and it's helping us survive. And so how is it being used in the argument, in that first maxim, that maxim of action that we were talking about? It is the reason why you ought to kill yourself. So here we see the contradiction. We see pain being used as the reason for suicide, when in fact it is not the reason for suicide. Pain is an indicator and a helper of surviving. It is something that helps you survive and prolong your life. And this is the law of nature, the principle of the law of nature, the categorical imperative in action.